If you want dinner, lick it off the floor. Marcus's laughter rang out harshly, drowning out the soft jazz playing through the mansion. He had just knocked the plate of chocolate pastries from my hands. Pieces of cake scattered pitifully across his polished leather shoes and the luxurious marble floor. Every eye, his senior colleagues and business partners, turned toward us. A deadly silence fell over the room. Marcus looked at me with open contempt. He was no longer the polite son-in-law I once knew. He was a man freshly promoted, drunk on the illusion of power. Tilting his head, he said quietly, yet loud enough for those nearby to hear, that the old man had clearly lost his mind, and that perhaps a nursing home was more suitable for me than a high-class party like this. I didn't shout. I didn't make a scene. 40 years in military intelligence had taught me that the first man to reveal his emotions is the first man to lose. I lowered my gaze to the mess at my feet, then slowly lifted my eyes to meet his. Marcus hesitated. Perhaps he expected trembling or a desperate apology. Instead, he found the stillness of a lake just before the storm. I stood straight in my jacket and said 3 words that terrified him. I know everything. The smile on Marcus's face froze. The color drained from his cheeks, shifting from wine red to a strange pale white. He tried to speak, but his throat locked up. I could see sweat beginning to form on his forehead. He knew exactly what I meant. He knew the filthy secret he had hidden for the past 3 weeks had just been exposed. I stepped closer, leaned near his ear, and whispered that this was only the appetizer. Tomorrow, I would do something far worse. Then I turned and walked away, leaving him standing frozen in the middle of the whispering crowd. Marcus had no idea that his plan to destroy my daughter had officially failed the moment I spoke those words. He thought he was the predator. But he had forgotten one small detail. His wife's father used to train real predators. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Stay with me until the end of this story and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see just how far this story has traveled. I stepped out of the banquet hall and felt the cold night air rush into my lungs. It all began 3 weeks ago when my daughter Sarah asked me to come by and watch the house for her. If I hadn't arrived 10 minutes earlier than planned that day, I might have remained forever blinded by the respectable mask my son-in-law wore so well. But fate had other plans. I stood there behind a half-closed door and heard things no father on earth would ever want to hear. A cruel plan was being laid out, one designed to push Sarah out of his life after he had drained every financial resource she had. Don't leave, because in just a moment I'll show you how a father quietly gathers evidence to trap a traitor. The hunt had only just begun. It all started on a gray Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks earlier. Sarah called me with the familiar rushed tone of a woman constantly spinning between meetings and deadlines. She asked if I could come over and wait for a plumber while she had to fly to Chicago for an urgent company project. I agreed immediately. For me, helping my daughter was the only real joy left for a retired old man living alone in a quiet apartment. I arrived 10 minutes early. When I unlocked the door with the spare key Sarah had given me, I was about to call her name, but a strange sound from the living room stopped me. It wasn't the television. It was the laughter of a woman, and Marcus's low voice. It was 2 in the afternoon. Marcus should have been at his law office. The instincts of a former military intelligence officer awakened instantly. I said nothing. Quietly, I stepped into the dark corner behind the large sofa in the study, where I could see through the narrow gap of the half-open door into the living room. Marcus stood there with his arms wrapped around a young woman in a bright red dress. It wasn't Sarah. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid they would hear it. Marcus kissed her hair and said he couldn't wait for the day they would finally be free. The woman's name was Amanda, an assistant at one of his partner firms. She asked about Sarah in a soft, playful voice. And that was the moment my heart felt like it was being crushed in my chest. Marcus gave a cold, mocking laugh. Sarah, he said. She's nothing more than a boring roommate now. Or more accurately, a business problem I have to manage, at least, until I finish draining our joint accounts. He continued in a cruel tone, saying he was sick of pretending to be the perfect husband. The promotion he was about to receive, he said, would be the perfect launchpad for filing for divorce without giving Sarah a single cent. He called my daughter a card that had already outlived its usefulness. I stood there, my fists clenched so tightly that my nails dug deep into my palms. Rage flared inside me like wildfire, but the discipline drilled into me by the military extinguished it immediately. If I burst into the room right now, the best I could do was punch him once, and everything would end in a meaningless scandal. He would have time to destroy the evidence, and Sarah would be the one who suffered most. So I stood still like a statue, watching them leave the living room and walk upstairs. Each step they took felt like another knife driven into my pride. I had misjudged him. I had entrusted my greatest treasure to a monster wearing a human face. When the bedroom door finally closed upstairs, I quietly slipped out of the house. I sat in my car for 2 hours, staring at the steering wheel. I asked myself where I had gone wrong, but eventually I realized this wasn't the moment for self-blame. This was the moment for action. Marcus believed he was a clever lawyer who could slip through every crack in the law. He believed a retired old man like me spent his days mowing the lawn and watching the evening news. What he didn't know was that for 40 years I had learned how to destroy the careers of men far smarter than him without leaving a single trace behind. I picked up my phone and called a number I hadn't dialed in years. On the other end was Tommy, an old teammate who specialized in technology and private investigations. I told him briefly that I needed surveillance equipment and a detailed financial report on Coastal Consulting Solutions. Tommy was silent for a second before asking if something big had happened. I looked back at Sarah's house and replied in an icy voice that someone had just crossed my final line, and I was about to teach him the price of underestimating a father. I started the engine and drove away. The plan was already forming in my mind. Marcus wanted a divorce while keeping every cent of the money. He wanted to leave my daughter with nothing after all the years she had sacrificed for him. I would show him what a real divorce looked like. But the one walking out of court with empty hands would be him. What would you do if you discovered your son-in-law was secretly planning to steal everything from your daughter? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because what I did next might surprise you. The next day I began my own professional investigation. I didn't tell Sarah. I needed undeniable proof, something so sharp and precise that Marcus would have no chance to defend himself. And when I started digging through his financial records, I realized the betrayal was far worse than I had imagined. Marcus wasn't acting alone in this performance. He had been preparing for it for a long time, and I intended to peel away every mask he wore until there was nothing left to hide his cowardice. This battle was only the opening move in a chain of collapses Marcus would never see coming. I met Tommy at a small diner tucked behind an old industrial district, a place where men like us could talk without worrying about curious ears. Tommy placed a thick brown envelope on the table. He looked at me with a trace of sympathy before sliding it across. "Darren," he said quietly, "you should brace yourself. Your son-in-law isn't just cheating. The guy's a vulture." I opened the file. Numbers began dancing in front of my eyes, but after decades of analyzing intelligence reports, I quickly grasped the core of the situation. Marcus had created a shell company called Coastal Consulting Solutions more than a year earlier. The truly disgusting part: he hadn't used his own money to run it. He had secretly withdrawn a total of $30,000 from the joint savings account he shared with Sarah. He did it through dozens of small transactions, just a few hundred to $1,000 each, carefully designed to avoid attracting Sarah's attention. She was always traveling for work, always busy. Marcus used that money to rent a luxury apartment for Amanda and to fund personal projects Sarah knew absolutely nothing about. I tightened my grip on the documents. That money was supposed to be the beginning of Sarah's dream, a vacation home for the family next year. Every dollar in that account came from her hard work and devotion to the life they were building together. And the man she trusted most had used it to build a second life with another woman. But that wasn't the worst part. Tommy pointed to a copy of Marcus's browsing history taken from his personal computer at home. Marcus had spent hours researching divorce law in this state, especially the clauses about minimizing spousal support and the strategies for proving that a wife was financially irresponsible. He had been quietly building a fabricated case to paint Sarah as a reckless spender and someone mentally unstable. His objective was crystal clear: once he secured his promotion, he would push Sarah out of his life and walk away with the house and all of their shared investments. Tommy asked what I wanted him to do next. I looked at the photo Tommy had taken Marcus and Amanda laughing together in front of the luxury apartment building. Then I told him I wanted every message, every email, and every money transfer between them backed up and encrypted. Catching Marcus cheating wasn't enough. I wanted to destroy his credibility in the legal world, where professional ethics were the only thing keeping him seated in that comfortable chair of his. I spent that entire night cross-checking timelines. Every time Sarah traveled for work, Marcus withdrew money. Every expensive gift he bought for Amanda had been listed as a client entertainment expense under his company. The level of calculation made me sick. Marcus believed he had planned everything down to the smallest detail. But he had forgotten the first rule of intelligence work. Every action leaves a trace. A strange calm began to settle over me. This was no longer just an affair. This was a fight for my daughter's future. Marcus liked to play the game of cat and mouse, but he didn't realize that the mouse he was chasing was actually an old tiger waiting quietly in the dark. I gathered the documents and stood up. I thanked Tommy and told him to keep following Amanda closely. I knew Marcus's promotion celebration party was scheduled for the following week. It would be the perfect stage for him to show off his new power, and it would also be the place where I would present him with a gift he would never forget for the rest of his life. Before leaving, I stopped in the diner's restroom and looked at myself in the mirror. The man staring back was no longer a quiet, retired old man. The soldier's eyes had returned. Marcus, you chose the wrong opponent. You thought you could deceive an honest woman and outsmart an old soldier. Soon you'll learn that your legal knowledge means nothing compared to the lessons I learned on the battlefield. Subscribe to see how I use intelligence tactics to confront this cunning lawyer, because in the next part the real cards will finally be laid on the table at that luxurious banquet. I drove home with every step of the plan clearly mapped out in my mind. Sarah needed to be strong. She needed to see the truth, even if it hurt more than anything she had ever experienced. But before that moment came, I would allow Marcus to enjoy the final fleeting seconds of his glory. The higher a man climbs, the harder he falls. And I was going to make sure Marcus fell all the way to the bottom. That night I placed Tommy's file inside the hidden safe beneath the floor of my house. It was where the truth would wait along with the death sentence for Marcus's career and reputation. The hunt had officially entered its decisive phase. Marcus had no idea that every step he took and every word he spoke was now being recorded, carefully preserved for the final act. Then the night of his promotion party arrived. It was a glamorous evening at the very house Sarah had lovingly decorated corner by corner. Marcus moved through the crowd of guests in an expensive suit, that smug smile never leaving his face. He looked like a king celebrating his kingdom. But to me he was nothing more than prey confidently walking into a trap. I stood quietly in a shadowed corner holding a glass of water and observing. Sarah stood beside him, forcing a polite smile, though I could clearly see the exhaustion in her eyes. Marcus barely acknowledged her presence. He was too busy charming his senior partners and boasting about becoming the youngest partner at his law firm. The moment reached its peak when Marcus asked everyone for their attention so he could give a speech. He began with empty words about hard work and success. Then his gaze shifted toward me. It was the look of a man granting a favor. Marcus said he was proud to have such a simple father-in-law, someone who had taught him the value of being satisfied with what one had, even if that meant living a modest, ambitionless retirement. The crowd burst into laughter. I saw Sarah lower her head, her shoulders trembling slightly. But Marcus wasn't finished. When a waiter passed by carrying a plate of my favorite chocolate pastries, Marcus accidentally bumped the tray. The plate fell to the floor, crumbs and cream splattering across my shoes. Instead of apologizing, Marcus laughed coldly. "Well," he said, "I suppose old age has slowed your reflexes, Dad." Then he added one final insult. "If you want that dessert so badly, maybe you should lick it off the floor. I wouldn't want trash ruining my perfect celebration." That was the moment my patience reached its limit. I could see the disgust in the eyes of several guests, but Marcus was too intoxicated by power to notice. He thought he was humiliating me. In reality, he was digging his own grave. I didn't get angry. I took out my handkerchief and calmly wiped the stains from my jacket. Then I stepped closer to him, right there, in the middle of a circle of the most powerful people in the city. My silence began to make Marcus uneasy. The smile on his face slowly faded as I looked straight into his eyes, the gaze of a soldier who had stared death in the face more than once. I adjusted his collar. The gesture was gentle but carried an undeniable authority. Then I leaned close to his ear and spoke slowly, clearly. "Dad knows everything." I saw his pupils shrink instantly. He stammered, asking what I meant. I only smiled a smile that made him shiver. Then I continued quietly, "I know about Coastal Consulting. I know about Amanda. And I even know about the safe you think is so well hidden." Marcus's face turned from red to ghostly pale in a matter of seconds. He tried to grab my arm, but I brushed his hand away without hesitation. Then I looked over at Sarah. My daughter stood there with tears running down her face. She wasn't crying because of the fallen dessert. She was crying because at last she had seen the true face of the man she called her husband. I turned to the guests and spoke calmly. "I apologize for interrupting this wonderful evening," I said. "But it seems my son-in-law has a few legal and ethical matters that require his immediate attention." Marcus stood frozen, his hands trembling. The confident lawyer who had been boasting moments earlier had completely vanished. "If you've made it this far, please do us a quick favor. Subscribe. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it means a great deal to us. Thank you very much." I took Sarah's hand and led her out of the room. As we passed Marcus, I left him with one final sentence. "Tomorrow, the real gift will begin to open." He stood motionless in the middle of the hall, surrounded by whispers from the very partners who had been praising him just minutes earlier. Now they looked at him like something contaminated. In the car on the way home, Sarah remained silent. I held my daughter's hand tightly and told her not to be afraid. "I'm here," I said. "And everything you've lost, I'll get back for you twice over." I knew Marcus wouldn't sleep that night. He would lie awake obsessing over what exactly I had in my hands. But no matter how much he guessed, he could never imagine the storm that was about to fall on him. The skills of 40 years in the military weren't decorations. I spent my life protecting my country, and now I would use everything I had learned to protect the most precious thing in my life. The confrontation at the party was only the opening shot. Tomorrow morning the truth would stand in the full light of day, and Marcus would finally understand that underestimating a father was the greatest and final mistake of his career. His performance was over. Now the sentence was about to begin. The next morning I asked Sarah to meet me at a small, quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, far away from the gossip of the legal world and the whispers left behind by last night's party. Sarah arrived with swollen eyes, but there was a steadiness in her posture that hadn't been there before. She looked at me. She didn't ask about the dessert plate. She didn't ask about the humiliation at the party. She asked only one thing. "Dad, what do you really know?" I didn't say much. I simply placed the file that Tommy and I had prepared on the table. It wasn't just a stack of papers. It was an indictment. Inside were the full financial records of Coastal Consulting Solutions, photographs of Marcus and Amanda together, and most importantly, the detailed plan Marcus had written, outlining how he intended to push Sarah out of the marriage with nothing. As Sarah turned the pages, I saw her hands begin to tremble. Then slowly, they clenched into fists. The pain in her eyes gradually gave way to something else. Determination. Sarah looked up at me and said quietly that she had been foolish to believe his promises. I took her hand. "You weren't foolish," I told her. "You were simply too kind to a man without a heart." Then I added softly, "But that kindness ends today." At that exact moment, Sarah's phone rang. Marcus. He had apparently discovered that the original documents were missing from the safe in his home office. I signaled for Sarah to answer and put the call on speaker. Marcus's voice was shaking, half threat, half desperation. He claimed everything was a misunderstanding, that the money had been moved only to invest in their shared future. I took the phone from Sarah and spoke calmly. "Your future ended the moment you knocked that dessert plate to the floor, Marcus." Then I added, "Now it's time for you to face the present. We'll meet at your office at 10 a.m., together with Sarah's lawyer." The final confrontation took place in the very office Marcus had once proudly shown off, walls decorated with awards and framed achievements. Marcus sat there looking 10 years older overnight. Around him were several colleagues watching with growing suspicion. Sarah walked in. She was no longer the silent, obedient wife. She placed the prenuptial agreement Marcus had once forced her to sign onto the desk. Marcus let out a strained laugh. "That document clearly states you get nothing if we divorce," he said. But Sarah cut him off coldly. She pointed to a small clause, one Marcus himself had added years earlier to protect his own interests. The clause stated that if either party attempted to conceal or transfer joint assets, or committed serious ethical misconduct that harmed the other's financial standing, the violating party would lose all inheritance rights and be 17, required to repay double the amount taken. Marcus's face turned the color of ash. He had forgotten that he himself had inserted that clause years ago to protect himself from Sarah. Now it had become the very chain tightening around his own neck. I stepped forward and placed another document on the table, a formal complaint for professional misconduct to the Bar Association. Then I spoke calmly. If you sign this divorce settlement, return the full $30,000 and leave the house immediately, we'll consider not sending this complaint to the bar. I paused. But if you refuse, you won't just lose the money. You'll lose the license you spent your entire life earning. Silence filled the room. Marcus looked around, searching for support. He found none. The colleagues he had once treated with arrogance were now looking away. Amanda had already disappeared. The moment she heard Marcus was under financial investigation. His hand trembled as he picked up the pen. Slowly, humiliatingly, he signed the agreement. When we stepped out of that office, Marcus called after me with a bitter voice. "You think you've won," he shouted. "You've destroyed my life." I stopped and turned to face him. "No, Marcus," I said quietly. "I didn't destroy your life. I simply returned to you exactly what you planted." Then I added one final sentence. "The best revenge isn't anger, it's justice." I took Sarah's hand and walked forward without looking back. I saw my daughter take a deep breath, as if a crushing weight had finally been lifted from her chest. Marcus had lost everything. He lost control of the assets. He lost the career he had chased so obsessively. And most importantly, he lost the respect of every person around him. The coming months would force him to live with exhaustion, humiliation, and struggle, the very future he had planned for my daughter. Sarah and I walked toward the parking lot where bright sunlight poured across the pavement. A dark chapter had finally ended. And I knew that with the strength inside her, Sarah would rise again stronger than ever. As for me, I would always stand there, whether in the shadows or in the light, to make sure no one ever hurt my family again. 6 months after that fateful confrontation, I sat on a wooden bench in the park, watching Sarah laugh and talk happily beside David. David was a calm, thoughtful architect. He didn't wear flashy suits or speak with the polished charm Marcus once used so effortlessly. But in the way he looked at my daughter, I saw something far more valuable: genuine respect and sincerity. He didn't see Sarah as a business problem. He saw her as his world. Sarah had used the money she recovered from Marcus to start a legal support fund for women who are financially manipulated in marriage. She was no longer the quiet, patient woman she used to be. Marcus's betrayal had unintentionally forged a new version of Sarah, strong, decisive, and deeply compassionate. I looked down at my aging hands. These were the same hands that once held a rifle to protect the border, and the same hands that turned the darkest pages of hidden documents to protect my daughter's future. Many people asked me why I didn't take a harsher revenge against Marcus, why I didn't use violence to release my anger. I simply smiled and told them, the best revenge is not rage. It is patience, planning, and helping good people rebuild a better life. Violence only creates more destruction, but intelligence and careful preparation create lasting justice. Marcus now works at a small consulting firm in a remote town. He lives in a cramped rented apartment and carries the weight of enormous debt on his shoulders. And that is the sweetest justice of all. Watching a man who once looked down on others finally taste the same poverty he had planned for someone else. I stood up, adjusting my wool cap as a gentle spring breeze brushed past me. Life always brings cruel turns, but as long as we refuse to give up, as long as we have the courage to face the truth, light will always appear at the end of the road. I no longer lie awake at night worrying about Sarah. She's all right now. And so am I. If you've listened this far, I know you're someone special. Join our community by hitting like and subscribing to hear more raw, real stories about family and life. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. I walked towards Sarah and David feeling a strange sense of peace. A soldier may retire. A father may grow old. But the instinct to protect the people we love never disappears. It's never too late to start again. And it's never too late to protect the people we love with all our heart and all our wisdom. My story ends here, but I hope it serves as a reminder to anyone feeling trapped or powerless. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is simply the preparation for the most spectacular reversal of all. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you again in the next stories on Dad's Real-Life Revenge. I was sitting in a cardiology clinic and happened to notice a photograph of a woman on the doctor's desk. She was wearing a navy blue silk dress, As I absent-mindedly looked at the photo, the doctor walked in and said, "That's Diana, my fiancée. We got engaged last weekend." But the woman in the photo was Meredith, the wife who had lived with me for the past 8 years. I had personally zipped up the back of that navy blue silk dress. That day she had kissed me on the cheek. She told me she was going out for tea with an old friend. But in this photograph she was beaming with happiness, her hand tightly intertwined with Dr. Julian's under the sunlight of the Amalfi Coast. "Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. I'm Dr. Raymond Vance, an experimental chemist. Grab a glass of water, some snacks, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose otherwise." Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe, you're going to enjoy this one. Before the doctor had even finished speaking, my heart felt as though it had stopped beating. My body felt ready to explode and anger consumed every ounce of reason. My ears rang. A sudden surge of adrenaline rushed through me. The room temperature was 15 degrees Celsius, yet I felt an icy chill spread through my entire body. Meredith, or Diana, the woman lying beside me every night, was in fact another man's fiancée. This betrayal tasted like rusted metal. My brain immediately switched into the analytical mode of a scientist. I did not scream. I did not flip over the desk. I chose silence and observation. I looked directly at Julian, noting every gesture he made as though he were a specimen in a laboratory. I needed quantitative evidence before reaching a final conclusion. Hatred is a chemical reaction with a very long half-life, and I would be the one in control of that reaction. That evening, I sat across from Meredith at the oak dining table in our home. On the table was a plate of seafood linguine. The aroma of butter, garlic, and thyme blended together to create an incredibly warm atmosphere. If it had been yesterday, I would have thought this was heaven. But now this room was merely a laboratory, and the woman sitting across from me was a specimen requiring psychological dissection. As Meredith twirled strands of linguine around her fork, she told me about an afternoon shopping trip with her best friend. She spoke naturally. There was not the slightest fluctuation in her tone, not a single misplaced blink. Her blinking frequency was 14 times per minute, completely within the range of someone telling the truth. This level of deception had achieved biological perfection. But I knew the truth. Earlier that day she had been in Julian Montgomery's arms under the name Diana. "You look tired today," Raymond Meredith said. Her voice was as soft as velvet. Her slender hand lightly touched the back of mine. Her body temperature was approximately 36.5 degrees Celsius. Yet it felt as though I had just touched a block of Arctic ice. The sensation was disgusting. I had to summon every ounce of willpower to keep the muscles in my face from twitching. I smiled. A carefully calculated smile designed so that the facial muscles relaxed by exactly the right amount. "Just a few problems at the laboratory, sweetheart. Compound B is experiencing a slight margin of error in the final testing phase." When Meredith heard the words Compound B, her pupils dilated by approximately 0.5 millimeters within a tenth of a second. It was the unmistakable reaction of greed. I silently finished my plate of pasta. The contrast between the warm meal and the cold conspiracy within this house made me nauseous. That night, lying beside her, I listened to the steady breathing of the woman who had shared my life for 8 years. 8 years is a significant portion of a lifetime. I wondered whether any of it had been real or merely an illusion. I stared up at the dark ceiling. My mind began connecting the events one by one. A terrible suspicion emerged. This woman's betrayal was not merely an affair. It was connected to the work that represented my life itself. I needed to check the server system immediately. Something horrifying was hidden within the company's network data files, something I had overlooked. 200A. I walked down to the basement. This was where the personal server system connected to the network of the biotechnology corporation I had founded was located. I did not turn on the lights. The blue glow from the computer screens reflected off the walls, creating long, distorted shadows. The cooling fans hummed softly in the darkness. I entered the master administrator access code. My fingers tapped across the mechanical keyboard, producing dry, clicking sounds. I began running a command to review the system's access history over the past 30 days. I was looking for an unidentified IP address, or some kind of data breach. The results appeared after 4 minutes and 12 seconds of scanning. At 3:45 a.m. on the Monday of the previous week, an account had logged into security level 4. It was my personal account. But at that time I had been fast asleep. Asleep because of the supplement pill Meredith gave me every night. A massive amount of data, precisely 847 megabytes, had been downloaded onto an external flash drive. Those 847 megabytes were not just numbers. They represented my entire 12-year research project on Compound B, a serum capable of reversing the aging process of heart cells. An invention worth tens, perhaps even hundreds of millions of dollars. But it did not stop there. The person who stole the data was highly intelligent. She had not merely copied it. I opened the original molecular structure formula file on the server. On line 14000 of the code, the hydrogen bond index had been altered from 2.4 to 2.1, an extremely subtle modification. If put into mass production, the compound would be ineffective. Worse, it would cause acute heart failure after 6 months of use. Meredith did not just want to steal my research. She was carrying out a deliberate act of sabotage. She wanted to turn me into a failed scientist, a madman responsible for creating a defective product, all before she and Julian Montgomery disappeared together with the perfect version she had hidden away. I leaned back in my chair. The anger rose and lodged itself in my throat. The woman I loved was slowly pushing me toward death. Then I heard a faint sound from the top of the staircase. Soft footsteps. Meredith was moving toward the basement door. Had she discovered that I was down here? The footsteps paused briefly at the top stair. I quickly shut off the computer screen. The entire room collapsed into darkness. My heart pounded, but I kept my breathing steady. A moment later, the footsteps retreated back toward the bedroom. I let out a quiet sigh of relief. Disaster had been postponed for a few more hours. The next morning, I did not go to the corporate office. Instead, I drove to a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. It was a secluded place. A man was waiting for me at a table hidden in the corner. It was Ethan, my only son from my late wife. 3 years earlier, Ethan and I had a fierce argument right in the living room. Ethan had pointed directly at Meredith and said she was a venomous snake. At the time, I had been blinded by her manufactured kindness. I slapped my son. I threw him out of the house. For the past 1095 days, I had not made a single phone call to him. The pride of a successful man had turned me into a blind fool. Ethan sat there. He was thinner than before. His hands were rough with calluses from working in a machine shop. When I sat down, he did not look at me with resentment. Instead, he pushed an old brown folder toward me. The edges were worn and frayed. "I've been waiting for this day for 3 years, Dad," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. "I knew you wouldn't believe me without quantitative evidence." I opened the folder. Inside were dozens of photographs taken by a private investigator over the past 3 years. Meredith had not only been meeting Julian Montgomery, there were also photographs of her meeting with attorneys who specialized in asset transfers. Records showed cash transactions moving from her secondary accounts into offshore banks in the Cayman Islands. I turned to the final pages. There was a copy of a death certificate belonging to a man named Arthur Pendleton, a real estate millionaire who had died from sudden heart failure 9 years earlier. Beside it was a wedding photograph of Arthur. The woman standing next to him, smiling sweetly, was Meredith under an entirely different name. I looked at my son. Regret rose in my throat like poison. I had driven away the only blood relative I had in order to protect a vampire. I reached across the table and took Ethan's rough hand. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I was wrong. This is an error. I will correct myself." Ethan looked at me, his gaze unwavering. "Dad, we need a plan. She's about to make her move. There's one last page in that file. I received it this morning. It will show you just how ruthless she really is." The last page of the file was a money transfer receipt. The recipient was another private investigation firm. The assignment read, "Monitor and collect information on the daily habits of Ethan Vance." Meredith was targeting my son. She wanted to eliminate every obstacle around me. Meredith's next move came faster than I had anticipated. 2 days later, I used a master key that I had secretly duplicated. I entered Meredith's private office in the mansion while she was away. Inside a hidden drawer beneath her vanity desk, I found a medical file. It bore the red seal of Dr. Julian Montgomery's clinic. It was a psychiatric cognitive assessment under my name, Raymond Vance. According to the documents, I had undergone cognitive evaluations over the previous 6 months, The results indicated that I was suffering from early-onset dementia accompanied by acute paranoid symptoms. My cognitive score had been reduced to 12 out of 30. That was the level of someone deemed incapable of making legal decisions independently. Every signature on the examinations was mine. I suddenly remembered the paperwork I had signed acknowledging office supplies, or the authorization forms for laboratory cleaning crews. Meredith occasionally handed them to me while I was busy overseeing chemical reactions. She had cut, pasted, and fabricated this entire medical record. Her ultimate objective was revealed on the final page: a petition for full legal guardianship filed under Meredith's name. If a court approved this package, I would officially lose control of the Biotechnology Corporation. I would lose ownership of Compound B. Every asset I possessed would fall under the management of my lawful spouse, Meredith Vance. She would have the legal authority to sell my life's work, and she could have me committed to a psychiatric institution until the day I died. Before I reveal the $80 million agreement that did not contain my name anywhere on it, if you've made it this far, then perhaps you've found this story interesting. Please help us with one small and quick favor: like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've watched this far, and predict how the story will end to see if your guess is correct. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. I stood frozen in her office. The file trembled violently in my hands. This was no longer an ordinary case of stolen data. It was a perfectly planned death sentence. I immediately took the file to someone I trusted: Audrey Kensington, a close attorney and my friend since college. After 48 hours of searching judicial databases and national archives, Audrey called me to her office at midnight. Her face was pale. Audrey looked at me and said, "Raymond Meredith is not her real name. The person who has been sleeping beside you for the past 8 years carries the bloodline of a ghost from your past, someone you could never have imagined." Audrey threw a newspaper from 15 years ago onto the desk. The headline immediately caught my eye: Thorne Biotech, officially bankrupt following scientific ethics scandal. I stared at the black and white photograph of the man featured in the article. Alistair Thorne. My greatest rival in the biotechnology race all those years ago. Raymond Meredith is not her real name. Her birth name is Diana Thorne, Audrey said, her voice grave. She is Alistair Thorne's only daughter. Memories from 15 years earlier flooded back into my mind like a slow-motion film. That year, I discovered that Alistair had been using falsified data in clinical trials involving human subjects. I formally reported the entire matter to the Medical Ethics Council. Alistair Thorne lost his patents. His corporation collapsed. 6 months later, he took his own life in his private office, unable to bear the humiliation. At the time, Diana Thorne had been only 16 years old. She disappeared from the country immediately after her father's funeral. She changed her identity. She underwent extensive facial reconstruction surgery. Then, 15 years later, she appeared in my life as what seemed like a perfect twist of fate. I thought it was destined love. But it was not. It was an equation of revenge that had been carefully calculated long before it ever reached me. Her motive had never been money alone. The profits from selling Compound B were merely a bonus. Diana Thorne's true objective was vengeance. She wanted me to experience exactly what her father had endured: the destruction of a reputation, the loss of a lifetime's work, and the madness of isolation inside an empty psychiatric institution. Hatred is a chemical reaction with a remarkably long half-life. Diana Thorne had nurtured it in her bloodstream for 15 years. She had used her body and 8 years of her youth as bait. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the bone-deep cold of the truth. But a scientist never surrenders to a toxic variable. To break a structure apart, you must first identify its weakest bond. The weakest bond in Diana's plan was Dr. Julian Montgomery. He believed he was her only lover and trusted accomplice. He had no idea that he, too, was merely a chess piece awaiting removal from the board. I gathered the files and rose to my feet. It was time for me to meet Julian Montgomery and put every card on the table. A counter-trap was beginning to take shape. At 4:00 p.m. the following day, I walked into Julian Montgomery's clinic without an appointment. I locked the office door from the inside. Julian looked up at me in surprise. "Raymond, you don't have an appointment today," he said, his voice tinged with confusion. I did not say a word. I walked straight to his desk. Then I placed 3 documents in front of him. The first was a copy of Meredith's secret bank account in the Cayman Islands, where she had transferred $5 million the previous week. The same money she had told Julian was their shared savings for a future escape abroad. The second was a copy of a corporate acquisition agreement with Garrison Brooks's conglomerate. The sole beneficiary listed in the contract was a shell company owned exclusively by Diana Thorne, and the third most important of all was the medical file of Arthur Pendleton, the millionaire husband who had died of heart failure 9 years earlier. Julian stared at the documents. His complexion shifted from healthy pink to ghostly white in less than 30 seconds. I estimated his heart rate was now well above 110 beats per minute. Cold beads of sweat began forming on his forehead. "You see, Julian," I said, my voice level and cold as a machine carved from ice. "You think you are Diana's lover, her accomplice, her fiancé. But in her equation, you are merely a tool with an expiration date." I tapped the medical file. "You signed the fraudulent psychiatric evaluations that declared me mentally incompetent. When law enforcement gets involved, who do you think will go to prison for falsifying records and conspiracy to commit murder?" I paused. "You. Meanwhile, she'll be flying to Switzerland with $80 million under a brand new identity. You're nothing more than a disposable pawn, just like Arthur Pendleton was 9 years ago." Julian collapsed back into his chair. The sophisticated, confident physician had become a trembling man consumed by fear and humiliation. His blind faith had been shattered by precise, undeniable facts. He looked up at me, desperation in his eyes. "What do I do, Raymond?" he whispered. "Please help me." She told me she loved me. I leaned forward and looked directly into his eyes. "Cooperate with me. That is your only chance of avoiding 20 years in prison." Julian nodded in despair. The alliance of the deceived had officially been formed. But this revenge plan was still missing one critical piece. Garrison Brooks, the billionaire industrialist preparing to place $80 million into the hands of a devil. Ethan and I would have to reach him that very night, before it was too late. At 1:100 p.m. that same night, Ethan, attorney Audrey Kensington, and I held a secret meeting at a 5-star hotel. The person seated across from us was Garrison Brooks, the notorious billionaire tycoon who was preparing to purchase Compound B from Meredith for $80 million. At first, Garrison Brooks was furious when he saw me enter the room. Meredith had spent months telling him that I had completely lost my mental capacity. According to her, I was undergoing special treatment in a psychiatric institution. But the moment I opened my laptop and displayed the technical evidence, the instincts of a seasoned billionaire took over. He fell silent. The cold certainty of numbers has a way of convincing people. "This is the 847 megabyte data file Meredith stole from my system," I said, pointing at the code displayed on the screen. "And this is line 14,000, the one that was deliberately altered. The hydrogen bond index was reduced." I enlarged the section. "Garrison, if you sign the contract for this version tomorrow, you'll be paying $80 million for a pile of chemical garbage capable of killing people. Your corporation will be buried under heart failure lawsuits within 6 months." Garrison Brooks slammed his hand onto the table. The crystal glass beside him rattled violently. The veins in his neck bulged with rage. "That lying bitch," he roared. "She was going to trap me with defective research. I'm calling the FBI and the police right now." "No, don't." I raised a hand to stop him. A cold smile appeared on my lips. "If you contact law enforcement now, she'll destroy the original evidence and disappear using a false passport. Let her believe she has already won." I leaned forward. "Tomorrow's board meeting proceeds exactly as scheduled. Bring the $80 million check to the conference room." My smile widened slightly. "I want her to experience what it feels like to fall from the highest peak into the deepest abyss at maximum gravitational acceleration." Garrison Brooks studied me. Then he looked toward Ethan, who stood beside me with unwavering determination. Slowly, the billionaire sat back down. He took a deep breath and regained his composure. "All right, Raymond," he said at last. "I'll play my part in this performance. She's going to pay for her arrogance." That night, I returned to the mansion. Meredith was already asleep. I stood in the darkness, staring at the woman behind the fabricated identity. Tomorrow would be Judgment Day. Every piece on the board was finally in position. What I did not know was that Diana Thorne still possessed one final hidden card. A card powerful enough to overturn the entire outcome of the meeting scheduled for the following day. At 9:00 a.m. on Friday, the main conference room of Vance Biotech was flooded with sunlight. Meredith entered the room, wearing an elegant white business suit, carrying herself like a queen about to claim her throne. Her hair was arranged in a sophisticated bun. Her eyes sparkled with triumph. Without hesitation, she sat in the chairman's seat that rightfully belonged to me. Seated beside her were several attorneys and billionaire tycoon Garrison Brooks. "Ladies and gentlemen shareholders," Meredith began. Her voice rang confidently through the microphone. "My husband Raymond Vance has unfortunately developed severe mental health issues. This is the official evaluation signed by Dr. Julian Montgomery. As his sole legal guardian, I hereby announce the transfer of ownership rights for Compound B to Mr. Garrison Brooks's corporation for $80 million. She smiled arrogantly. Her slender fingers lifted a fountain pen. She was seconds away from signing the contract that would determine all our futures. Suddenly, the conference room doors burst open. I walked in. Beside me were not my usual assistants. There was my son Ethan, attorney Audrey Kensington, and 3 agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Meredith froze. The fountain pen slipped from her hand and struck the glass tabletop with a sharp crack. Her expression shifted from confidence to shock in a fraction of a second. Then she shot to her feet. "Raymond, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in a psychiatric hospital. Security, get this insane man out of here. The person who needs to leave isn't me, Sandra Voss." I spoke loudly. I deliberately pronounced her birth name slowly and clearly. The moment the name Sandra Voss echoed through the room, every trace of confidence vanished from her face. She staggered backward. The chairman's chair nearly tipped over. "Dr. Julian Montgomery, please come in," Audrey said. Julian entered through the doorway behind us. A thick stack of original medical records was clutched in his hands. He could not even bring himself to look directly at Sandra. "I have confessed everything to the FBI," he said. "All of Dr. Raymond Vance's medical evaluations were fraudulent. Sandra Voss orchestrated and coerced the entire scheme." I walked toward the conference table. I looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had shared my bed for 8 years. "You believed you stole 847 megabytes of perfect data, Sandra," I paused. "A scientist always creates encrypted traps to protect valuable assets. The file you downloaded was a deliberately flawed version that I had prepared 3 months earlier when I first began noticing suspicious behavior from you. The perfect version never left my original server." Garrison Brooks stood. Without a word, he withdrew the $80 million check. "The game is over, Sandra," he said coldly. One of the FBI agents stepped forward. He produced an official arrest warrant. "Sandra Voss, you are under arrest for identity fraud, large-scale financial fraud, and conspiracy to poison and harm the health of Raymond Vance." The metallic click of handcuffs echoed sharply through the room. Sandra stared at me with eyes overflowing with hatred and despair. She was escorted from the conference room before the entire board of directors. 15 years of plotting by the Voss family had collapsed in less than 5 minutes. The revenge was complete, executed through a mathematical equation with no margin of error. She was escorted toward the police vehicle. But as she reached the grand lobby of the corporation, Sandra suddenly turned back and looked at me. A ghostly smile appeared on her face. Then she whispered a single sentence. The words froze the blood in my veins. This plan had never been hers alone. Her true accomplice was still standing right beside me. The true accomplice. I looked around the conference room. My eyes settled on Julian. He was trembling. But it was not him. He had only ever been a pawn. My gaze shifted to someone else. The corporation's attorney, the man who had quietly helped Sandra legitimize the guardianship documents without my knowledge. The final truth had been stripped down to its core layer. The FBI immediately detained him. My mathematical equation contained no errors. It merely required a few additional seconds to complete its final calculation. 1 month after that day of judgment, the official launch of Compound B was an overwhelming success at the National Convention Center. Vance Biotech's stock surged by 35% during its very first trading session. The media called me a genius, a survivor, a hero who had escaped a shocking family conspiracy. But I was not present at the celebration filled with cameras and applause. Instead, I sat in my old laboratory in the basement. The room was quiet. Only the soft hum of the cooling system filled the air. Ethan walked in carrying 2 cups of hot coffee. He placed one on the table in front of me and sat down across from me. The rich aroma of freshly roasted coffee warmed a place that had once felt unbearably cold. I looked at my son. I looked at the calluses on his hands. Then, I looked back at the glowing chemical vials lined up on the shelves. Throughout my scientific career, I had spent tens of thousands of hours searching for complex structural formulas. I wanted to discover compounds that could extend human life, but I had forgotten the most fundamental truth of all. Life only has value when it is surrounded by honesty and genuine love. The pride of a successful man had once turned me into a blind fool. I believed the sweet words of an enemy wearing a flawless mask, and because of that I drove away my only son, the one person willing to spend 3 years of his life quietly protecting me from the darkness. Compound B could heal damaged heart tissue, but it could not heal a soul wounded by betrayal. The only things capable of doing that are forgiveness and the courage to face one's own mistakes. The truth may arrive late, but it is always the most accurate answer. Never allow pride to prevent you from listening to the people who truly love you. The truth never becomes outdated. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. Join our community by pressing the like and subscribe buttons to enjoy more compelling and emotionally powerful family stories. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. My daughter-in-law sprang to her feet, walked straight over to my wife, and shouted in her face, "Get out of here right now." That clacking sound is so annoying. That was how she opened her own birthday party. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a glass of water, some snacks, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they just chose wrong. Leave a comment with the number 1, so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe, you're going to enjoy this one. It was a summer evening in Manhattan. The glow of chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling reflected off sparkling crystal glasses. The laughter and conversations of the upper class filled the room without pause. Ethan, my son, stood beside his wife. Both of them wore expensive, custom-designed outfits. They smiled brightly as they welcomed influential figures from the business world. My wife, Megan, and I were seated at a table tucked away in a corner. My wife had recently endured a long illness. Her legs had grown much weaker. Every step required the support of an old wooden cane. As soft orchestral music played in the background, Megan wanted to use the restroom. Holding on to the edge of the table, she slowly rose to her feet. Her wooden cane tapped against the marble floor, producing a faint clacking sound. That sound felt completely out of place in such a luxurious setting. Mia was standing nearby. She immediately turned around. Her eyes swept over Megan's outdated coat before stopping on the cane. Her expression hardened. Without a moment's hesitation, she hurried over. She spoke loudly enough for 3 nearby tables to hear. She said my mother's presence was ruining the group photos with important business partners. She treated the presence of her mother-in-law as an inconvenience. And she did not stop there. In a harsh tone, she ordered my wife to leave. It was a level of disrespect that could not be tolerated. I did not look at Mia. I turned and looked at Ethan. My son stood there. He glanced at his watch and then looked away. He did not defend his mother at all. He stepped closer and lowered his voice, but his irritation was unmistakable. He told his mother to listen to Mia. He said she did not fit the sophisticated atmosphere of the event. He advised us to take a taxi home early so we would not ruin everyone's good time. My wife was stunned, tears welling in her eyes. Her hand trembled as she gripped the cane tightly. The wrinkles on her face tightened with hurt. Yet she remained silent and did not argue. Megan had always been that way, spending her entire life enduring hardship for her children. The ingratitude of the son we had raised cut deeply into the dignity of both of us. I remained seated. I did not get angry and I did not raise my voice. I simply stayed silent. The silence of a man who had already traveled through nearly all of his life. I looked directly into the eyes of my son and my daughter-in-law. I wanted them to know what was about to happen to them right now. In my mind, a major decision had already been made. I slowly rose to my feet and adjusted the collar of my suit jacket. I walked over to Megan and took hold of her frail arm. I supported her by the elbow. She leaned her full weight against me. The clacking of her wooden cane echoed once again, slow and solitary, as we made our way toward the exit. The entire banquet hall suddenly fell silent. Every eye turned toward the two elderly people being quietly shown the door. Mia smiled faintly, the look of triumph obvious on her carefully made-up face. Ethan let out a sigh of relief. Perhaps he thought the problem had finally been solved. But they were wrong. My silence always came with a very expensive price. From the central table, Arthur rose to his feet. He was the chairman of the largest investment firm in Manhattan, and also the man Ethan had practically begged for 3 months just to secure a meeting with. Arthur did not say a single word. He slowly buttoned his suit jacket and stepped away from the table. He did not look at Ethan, nor did he spare Mia a glance. He walked straight toward me. Behind him, two other billionaires from the banking industry's board of directors stood up at the same time. They silently followed him. That powerful silence seemed to drain all the air from the room. The entire ballroom froze. The smile on Mia's lips stiffened. Ethan's face turned pale. He stammered as he called Arthur's name, but the chairman never looked back. They walked alongside my wife and me, protecting the dignity of the true founders. Arthur's black limousine was already waiting, with its engine running at the entrance. He personally opened the door for Megan. Only after my wife and I were comfortably seated in the back did Arthur look at me, give a slight nod, and signal for the car to leave. Throughout the ride home, the interior of the vehicle remained completely silent. Megan stared out the window, watching the city lights drift by. She did not cry, but her hands were clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. I took hold of my wife's icy hand. I knew her heart was broken because of the son she had brought into this world. Ethan's coldness was a fatal knife wound in a mother's heart. I watched the first streaks of rain begin to gather on the window. In the darkness, I smiled calmly. Ethan and Mia believed they had climbed to the very top of high society. They were proud of their $1 million apartment and their rapidly growing company. But those two arrogant children did not know one truth. The foundation beneath their feet had been built entirely by my own hands. When the limousine stopped in front of our old house, I helped Megan out. I pulled out my phone and called the family's private attorney. My voice was calm but sharp in the darkness. I instructed him to prepare every document related to the secret trust fund. It was time for the ungrateful to learn what it felt like to lose the support they had always taken for granted. Early the very next morning, a confidential letter was delivered directly to Mia's office, carrying a terrifying secret capable of destroying her entire career overnight. The morning sunlight streamed through the window of our old house. On my desk sat the trust fund documents that my attorney had delivered earlier that morning. I flipped through the pages one by one. Ethan and Mia's names appeared under the beneficiaries section, but ultimate control still belonged to me. For many years I had deliberately chosen to stay in the background. I wanted my son to become independent. I wanted him to understand the value of hard work. But that generosity had created an ungrateful monster. The luxurious Manhattan apartment that Mia proudly showed off on social media had actually been purchased with money from this fund. Even her fast-growing media company would have gone bankrupt 3 years ago if it had not been for the financial backing I provided. My son and his wife were living inside an illusion of their own making. They believed their success came entirely from their own talent. They looked at elderly, modest people like us with contempt, treating us as a burden. I took a sip of hot tea. The bitter taste spread through my throat, mirroring the bitterness in my heart. No matter how magnificent a house may appear from the outside, if its foundation is built on sand, even a gentle breeze can make it sway. People are no different. When they forget their roots, when they forget those who sweated and sacrificed to pave the road before them, their collapse becomes only a matter of time. At that moment, photos from the previous night's party were beginning to flood online news outlets. Mia posted a lengthy article boasting about an upcoming international project that was about to be signed. She carefully edited out every trace of my wife and me. Ethan shared the post as well, adding words of praise for his wife. They were intoxicated by a false spotlight. What they did not know was that 3 of their most important business partners had just withdrawn their names from the guest list for the upcoming signing ceremony. My dignity could endure an insult, but the dignity of my old friends could not. I closed the file. The covers struck together with a dry sound. Megan entered the room, still holding her wooden cane with trembling hands. She looked at me with sad but understanding eyes. She did not ask me to forgive our son. She simply sat down in the chair across from me. The silence shared by 2 elderly spouses inside that large room carried an overwhelming weight. It was the silence that comes before a great storm. At that moment, the phone on my desk began to vibrate. The screen displayed my attorney's number. I answered immediately. The lawyer's voice lacked its usual calmness. He informed me that he had just uncovered an extremely unusual move from Mia's family. Mia and her parents had been secretly carrying out something outrageous behind our backs. They were targeting Megan, my loyal wife, with a scheme so cruel that it was beyond forgiveness. The attorney's voice on the phone was quiet, but every word that reached my ears felt like a stream of ice water. My in-laws were trying to gain access to the central hospital where Megan had undergone medical evaluations the previous month. They were using money and connections to bribe an associate department chief. Their goal was to alter my wife's medical records. They wanted to portray her as someone suffering from severe dementia, no longer capable of sound judgment. I kept the phone pressed to my ear. I did not interrupt, nor did I reveal so much as a sharp breath. I rose from my chair and walked to the window, looking out at the small yard where Megan was carefully watering her rose bushes. A woman who had spent her entire life being kind, who had never harmed even an ant, had now become the target of a hunt driven by the greed of her own son and daughter-in-law. If Megan were declared legally incompetent, control over the assets registered in her name within the trust would automatically pass to Ethan. That was why Mia wanted her mother-in-law pushed out of the party. She wanted to create the public impression that Megan was no longer mentally fit. Greed had blinded them. They did not just want money. They wanted to trample the dignity and the life of the woman who had brought one of them into this world. I ended the call. The phone felt cold in my hand. I returned to my desk and stared at a family photograph taken 10 years earlier. Back then, Ethan had been a good boy who would run to hug his mother whenever he came home from school. Now the greed of the woman beside him had transformed him into a heartless accomplice. When the moral foundation of a person has rotted away, they become capable of the most disgusting acts without feeling a trace of guilt. They wanted to test the strength of the foundation. Very well. I would show them the weight of a structure built over 40 years. I opened a secure drawer and removed a small voice recorder. It was the device my trusted assistant had used to capture an entire conversation between Mia's father and the associate department chief at a discreet cafe. Every piece of evidence, every amount of money discussed, had been recorded with undeniable clarity. I gripped the recorder tightly in my palm. The father's voice, sharp and chillingly calm, echoed through the empty room. I did not send the evidence to the police immediately. Nor did I call Ethan to warn him. A true hunter always waits until the prey reaches the peak of its arrogance. I knew that 3 days later Mia's company would be hosting the signing ceremony for its international resort project. That would be the place where all of their glory was displayed, and it would also be the place I had chosen to bring everything to an end. What I did not expect was that very same evening Ethan would drive to our old house on his own, carrying a sinister contract in his hands. The engine of a luxury car came to a stop in front of our old house. The car door opened, and Ethan stepped inside wearing a perfectly tailored suit, though the exhaustion on his face was impossible to hide. He did not look at his mother, who was sitting beside the tea table knitting. Instead, he walked straight toward me and placed a stack of documents on the table. In the tone of a busy executive, he explained that the papers were an authorization agreement for asset management, supposedly to make investing in a new project more efficient. He claimed that because his mother's health had declined recently and her memory had become unreliable, it would be better for the entire family if the assets were placed under his control. I looked at the documents on the table and then raised my eyes to my son. He checked his watch twice within a single minute. To him, sitting in this old house and speaking with his parents was nothing more than a waste of valuable time. He was eager to return to Mia's glamorous world. I did not touch the pen he offered me. I simply remained silent. My silence lasted so long that Ethan began to grow uneasy. He started rambling about the future, about the enormous profits the international resort project would supposedly generate. I stood up and walked over to Megan. I placed a hand on my wife's frail shoulder and felt the faint tremble that ran through her body as she listened to the lies coming from our son. Then I turned and looked directly into Ethan's eyes. I told him to go home for now because I needed time to review everything carefully. Ethan was clearly displeased, but faced with my firm refusal, he reluctantly gathered the documents and stormed back to his car. Once the sound of the engine had completely faded into the distance, I turned on my computer. On social media, Mia had just posted a new photograph. It showed the corner of her luxurious office along with an arrogant caption about financial freedom and self-made success. Praise poured in from her followers like rain. They admired her as the embodiment of achievement. I read the words with complete calm. Not a single ripple disturbed my thoughts. They had soared so high because of the money flowing from my trust fund, and they genuinely believed they had reached the stars. I shut down the computer. Then I picked up my phone and called the largest partner involved in the international resort project, the owner of a multinational construction corporation. I did not use dramatic threats or grand speeches. I simply provided one brief piece of information regarding the true ownership structure of Ethan's company. I informed him who actually held ultimate authority behind the capital that guaranteed the entire operation. Every legal document had now been returned to its proper place. I was ready for the final act. The blueprint for the downfall of the arrogant had been completed. Tomorrow's international signing ceremony would be where I appeared to reclaim everything that rightfully belonged to me. What I could never have anticipated was that Mia had already prepared another vicious move to block my path. The event hall of a five-star hotel in the heart of the city was flooded with flashing cameras. A grand display bearing the name of the International Resort Project signing ceremony stood prominently at the main entrance. Ethan and Mia occupied the center of the hall. Dressed in their finest attire, holding glasses of wine, they smiled constantly as they posed for photographs with reporters. Confidence and arrogance were written across their faces. I entered through a side entrance. I had chosen a simple black suit, no flower on the lapel, no badge of distinction. Calmly, I walked to the last row of seats and quietly sat down. Not a single camera lens turned toward me. Not a single security officer bowed in greeting. To them, I was merely an old man who had wandered into the world of the wealthy. From a distance, Mia spotted me. Her expression shifted briefly before she quickly signaled for two large security guards to approach my seat. She walked over and positioned herself so that reporters could not see us. Lowering her voice, she spoke with a sharp, threatening tone. She said this was an international-level event, and that people without official business or membership credentials should leave immediately to avoid ruining the image of the occasion. She even implied that I had come here to tarnish her and Ethan's reputation because of what had happened at her birthday party. I did not stand up. I did not become angry. I simply looked directly into the eyes of my arrogant daughter-in-law and offered a calm smile. I told her she should take another careful look at the list of people who actually owned this project. Mia let out a contemptuous snort. Then she turned away and ordered the security guards to remove me. Just as the two guards were about to place their hands on my shoulders, the ceremony's opening music filled the hall. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, his voice booming through the powerful sound system. He announced that the signing ceremony was officially beginning. Ethan and the representative of the multinational construction corporation walked together onto the stage of honor. The entire audience erupted into applause. The MC began delivering the opening remarks. He respectfully introduced the largest shareholder, the person who held ultimate decision-making authority through 60% ownership of the entire resort project. This individual was also the true owner of the investment fund that financially backed Ethan and Mia's company. The entire hall held its breath, waiting to hear the name of a powerful figure from the financial world. Ethan proudly adjusted his tie, preparing himself to welcome the billionaire he had admired for so long. When the MC announced my name through the microphone, every spotlight in the hall immediately swept across the audience before stopping directly on the seat where I was sitting. Mia and Ethan froze where they stood, their faces twisted in shock as a horrifying truth shattered everything they thought they knew. It was a reality far beyond anything they had ever imagined. I rose to my feet beneath the spotlight. Slowly, I walked toward the stage. The sound of my leather shoes striking the wooden floor echoed with a dull rhythm. The entire hall fell silent. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on me, the old man, who only a minute earlier had been dismissed as someone who did not belong there. Ethan stood frozen in place. The color had completely drained from his face. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The pen he had intended to use for the signing slipped from his fingers and rolled across the glass table. Mia stood with her mouth hanging open, her eyes wide with fear. I stepped up to the podium. I did not look at my son or my daughter-in-law. Instead, I faced the board members and international investors seated before me. I did not need to shout into the microphone. With the calm, seasoned voice of a man who had lived through decades of experience, I began presenting the facts one by one. I publicly disclosed the documents showing how Mia's company had manipulated financial records to conceal bad debt. I presented evidence, proving that funds had been withdrawn from my trust without the approval of its founder. With every statement I made, the murmurs among the investors grew louder. They exchanged uneasy glances before turning toward Ethan with anger in their eyes. The representative of the multinational construction corporation immediately rose from his seat. He withdrew the contract that was moments away from being signed. Panic overtook Mia. She rushed toward me, attempting to seize the microphone. Stammering, she claimed that I was lying, that I was a cruel father trying to destroy his own children. I remained silent and took a single step backward. I had no need to argue with her. My attorney stepped onto the stage and placed another file on the table. It contained recorded evidence of the scheme to falsify Megan's medical records in an attempt to seize her assets. At that moment, the entire cruel truth was laid bare before the public. Outrage swept through the hall. Reporters fired off photographs without pause. Flash after flash illuminated Mia's pale face. I turned toward Ethan and announced that I was withdrawing 100% of the investment capital backing the company, effective immediately. The carpet beneath the feet of the arrogant had been completely pulled away. The collapse happened instantly. International partners turned their backs and walked out. The signing ceremony became the biggest embarrassment of the year. Mia crumpled onto the stage floor, expensive makeup streaking down her face with tears of humiliation. Ethan looked at me, his lips trembling as though he wanted to beg for mercy, but I had already turned away and begun walking toward the exit. The hollow foundation beneath them had finally given way. Yet the real punishment awaiting the two ungrateful souls was only the beginning of a far more devastating chain of tragedies than they could ever have imagined. If you've followed the story all the way to this point, then perhaps you've found it interesting. Please help us with one small and quick favor: like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've made it this far, and tell me your prediction for how the story will end to see if you're right. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. The media storm swept across the city overnight. Ethan and Mia's names flooded newspapers and news sites, not as successful young entrepreneurs, but as financial fraudsters and ungrateful children. Their downfall unfolded with terrifying speed. Once the financial backing from my trust fund was withdrawn, Mia's company immediately plunged into insolvency. The banks did not sit by and watch. They swiftly froze every account and seized the remaining assets belonging to the two of them. Just 2 days after the signing ceremony, their luxurious Manhattan apartment was sealed off. I stood across the street and watched quietly. Ethan and Mia stood on the sidewalk in the early season cold. Beside them were 5 cardboard boxes containing the few clothes and personal belongings they had left. Mia was no longer dressed in designer labels. She wore a simple coat. Her hair was disheveled, and she constantly tapped numbers into her phone. She called the people who had once praised her at exclusive social gatherings, but all she received were unanswered calls and abrupt hang-ups. Society's indifference toward those who no longer have money can be brutal. When you are at the top, everyone wants to be your friend. When you fall, they treat you like a contagious disease. Ethan sat hunched over on a cardboard box. His face was buried in his hands and his shoulders shook uncontrollably. He had lost everything: his reputation, his career, his wealth, and his self-respect. He glanced at Mia and then stared into empty space. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone. In its place was the misery of a child stripped of every layer of protection. They were finally experiencing what it meant to have no home and no money, just as they had once been willing to cast an elderly mother aside. I turned away without a trace of sympathy. A foundation built upon lies and ingratitude can end only one way. They would have to learn how to rise from the ruins they had created themselves. Over the next 2 weeks, nobody knew where Ethan and Mia had gone. They disappeared completely from Manhattan's elite circles, but I knew that material punishment alone was never enough for a child who had lost his conscience. The true torment would come when they realized they had lost the most valuable thing of all. Then, on a late afternoon, as the largest thunderstorm of the year poured over the city, frantic knocking echoed through the front door of our old house. It brought with it a heartbreaking sight, one that left Megan unable to hold back her tears. The rain hammered relentlessly against the metal roof of our old house. Thunder and wind howled outside the windows. I sat in my familiar wooden chair, holding a cup of tea that had long since begun to cool. Megan sat across from me, slowly knitting a sweater for the coming winter. The peaceful atmosphere inside our home felt completely detached from the chaos raging in the outside world. Then suddenly a frantic pounding echoed through the house. The knocking was forceful, mixed with muffled sobs coming from the other side of the wooden door. Megan flinched. Her frail hands froze in place. I gently rested my hand on my wife's shoulder, signaling for her to remain seated. Slowly, I rose from my chair and walked toward the living room window. Pulling back the curtain slightly, I looked through the rain-streaked glass. Ethan and Mia were kneeling on the ground in the middle of the yard. Their clothes were soaked through, clinging tightly to their bodies. Mia bore no trace of the arrogance she once carried. She cried uncontrollably while lowering her forehead to the concrete again and again. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face. Ethan knelt beside her, gripping the windowsill with both hands as he called out for his mother through sobs. He apologized over and over. He begged his parents to open the door and give them a chance to survive. They had nowhere left to go. No money, no home, no one willing to help them. Megan saw the scene through the glass. Her hands began trembling violently. Tears rolled down cheeks marked by age and hardship. She started to rise from her chair. She wanted to open the door. She wanted to embrace her son. But I stepped beside her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. I shook my head. The silence between us carried an enormous weight. I turned back toward the window and looked directly at my son, kneeling beneath the storm. I did not hate him. What I felt was a profound sadness. People often discover regret only after they have lost everything. The remorse displayed beneath that curtain of rain did not come from understanding what they had done to a mother. It came from needing shelter from the storm their own choices had created. I did not unlock the door. I remained motionless behind the glass, allowing their cries to be swallowed by the relentless rain. The words of a father echoed quietly through my mind, calm yet sharp as a blade. Some foundations once cracked beyond repair are not rebuilt. All that remains is to stand back and watch them collapse. It was too late for salvation. That night, the two broken figures eventually staggered away through the storm in complete despair. By the time dawn arrived, the old house stood nearly empty. Megan and I had packed our belongings the night before. We stepped outside and climbed into the car, ready to begin an entirely new chapter of our lives. Behind us, we left one final legacy, one that would make Manhattan's entire upper class bow their heads in respect. The sound of ocean waves gently rolled onto the white sandy shore. Breezes carrying the salty scent of the sea drifted across the porch. 3 months after that stormy night, Megan and I had moved to a peaceful coastal town. This morning, warm sunlight flooded the small yard. My wife sat in a wicker chair, the peaceful smile having finally returned to her face. Her hands no longer trembled as they once had. She was flipping through photographs of the charitable foundation that bore her name. Before leaving Manhattan, I used every remaining dollar from the trust fund to establish the Megan Foundation. It is an organization dedicated to providing support and medical care for elderly people living alone, for fathers and mothers abandoned by their children. I wanted to transform my family's pain into something meaningful for others. Members of high society and many former business partners generously contributed to the foundation. They respected us not because of wealth, but because of the moral legacy we had chosen to leave behind. I walked over and placed a warm cup of tea into Megan's hands. Together we looked out toward the distant sea. Money can buy a seat at the most luxurious banquet table, but it can never buy respect or love within a family. Too many young people today spend their lives chasing status and recognition. They view the aging and slowing of their parents as a burden. What they fail to realize is that those quiet figures standing in the shadows were the ones who laid the very first bricks in the foundation of their lives. If you see your parents as a burden, pause for a moment. That silent presence may be the very foundation keeping your life from collapsing. A house that loses its moral foundation will one day crumble no matter how tall it stands. Ethan and Mia paid an enormous price to learn that lesson. Today they are working long, difficult days on a farm in a remote rural area, earning just enough to survive. I have not given them another cent. It is the only way for them to rebuild the part of themselves they lost. Thank you for staying with Dad's real-life revenge until the end of this story. If this story gave you something to think about, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps stories about respect and kindness reach even more people. I took Megan's hand in mine. Together we had weathered every storm, and now it was finally time to enjoy true peace. In the end, the greatest happiness in life is growing old with someone whose shoulder you can still lean on and carrying a heart that is calm, content, and free of regret. Most people are afraid of coming home to an empty house. I came home early, and I wish to God the house had actually been empty. Welcome to Dad's True Life Revenge. Grab a snack, get comfortable, because this isn't the kind of story you can pause halfway through to make tea. And if you've ever had that feeling, that strange, hard to explain sense that something isn't right, not because you saw it, but because you felt it, like a scent in the air that doesn't belong there, then you know exactly what I mean. 23 years of marriage. 23 years of sharing a bed, a bank account, and a bathroom. Trust me, the bathroom is the real test of love. After that long, you develop something I can only describe as a sixth sense. You know when the other person is sad even when they're smiling. You know something's wrong before there's any proof. That afternoon I knew. From the moment I turned onto my street, I wasn't supposed to be there. My business trip to Denver ended a day early. Officially, the keynote speaker had a personal emergency. Unofficially, maybe he looked out at the audience and lost his faith in humanity. Either way, I caught the earliest flight home. No call. No text. I wanted it to be a surprise. Maybe I'd pick up Cassandra's favorite Thai food. Maybe for the first time in months we'd have dinner without a laptop sitting between us like a third person. I was in a good mood. That should have been my first warning. The first thing I noticed was the car. Preston's car. My son. 26, married with a perfectly decent apartment. One I helped furnish. So seeing his car parked in front of my house on a Tuesday afternoon wasn't strange. It was wrong. Completely wrong. I sat in my car for a few seconds staring at it, then said out loud, "Warren, why is your son's car here right now?" No answer. The second thing I noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the kind where people are just relaxing. This was heavy silence. The kind that makes the air feel thicker than it should be. I opened the door and stepped inside. And in that moment, everything changed. If you've made it this far, do me a small favor. Hit subscribe. Seriously. A lot of people watch but never do, and it costs you nothing, but it means more than you think. Thank you. Because what happened next was the moment I realized I wasn't the only one who knew something was wrong. Preston and Lindsay were sitting on the couch, together. And here's the part that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. They weren't watching TV, they weren't on their phones. They were just sitting there, like two people in a waiting room. The kind who've already accepted whatever news is coming. Preston looked up first, and I need you to pay very close attention to this detail. He wasn't surprised to see me. Think about that for a second. Your father is supposed to be in Denver. He's not due back for another day. And suddenly he walks through the front door, unannounced. And you don't react. No flinch, no question, no natural expression at all. Just a slow blink, and a look I can only describe as calculated. Lindsay smiled, and I'm telling you that smile had no business existing that afternoon. I set my bag down. I asked Pri, "What's going on? Where's your mother?" Preston cleared his throat. "Dad, we were just about to call you." I looked at him. "Really?" I didn't ask. I stated it. He gave a small nod. "Mom had an episode this morning," he said. "She's at Mercy General now. She's stable." I didn't hear anything after Mercy General. Everything else got cut off like someone muted the sound inside my head. I turned around. 11 seconds later, I was in the car. I know that sounds like a strange number, but shocked as that. It makes you remember meaningless details, while the important things try to tear you apart from the inside. I called Kurt on the way. Curtis Barnes. My best friend since 1987. He's seen me through everything: marital problems, 2 recessions, and the disaster that was my attempt to grow a beard in 2009. If there's anyone in this world who will tell me the truth without sugarcoating it, it's Kurt. He picked up on the second ring. "Warren, what's going on?" "Cassandra's in the hospital," I said. "Mercy General." I just got home, and Preston and Lindsay were sitting in the living room like they already knew how the movie ends. Silence. On the other end, then Kurt said, "What do you mean, knew how it ends?" "My son didn't react when I walked in," I said. "I'm supposed to be in Denver." Another pause. Then very quietly he said, "Warren, you need to stay calm." "I am calm," I said. "No," he replied. "You're driving. That's not the same thing." He wasn't wrong. Mercy General is 15 minutes from my house. I made it in 9. I will not be answering any questions about that. When I walked into the hospital, I knew one thing. That feeling I had standing at my front door. It didn't go away. It came with me. And now, it was bigger, heavier, sharper. It wasn't a hunch anymore. It was a warning. Dr. Beverly Nash met me at the nurse's station, a woman in her 50s, steady voice, unshaken eyes. I liked that. Right now, I needed stability more than anything. Mr. Trevor, she said, I'm glad you're here. Your wife was brought in this morning by your son. She paused just long enough for me to keep up. She's showing signs of severe disorientation. Her organs are under stress. And there are elevated levels of toxicity in her blood. Toxicity. I repeated the word like I could understand it better if I slowed it down. She nodded. We're running more tests, but I want to be direct with you. The pattern we're seeing doesn't match a sudden illness. Another pause. It suggests something. Cumulative. Cumulative. That word hit like a silent punch. I placed my hand on the counter, trying to keep my voice level. Doctor, are you telling me something has been introduced into my wife's system? She didn't answer right away. She looked straight at me. I'm saying we need answers. And I believe you do too. I walked into the room, and I thought I was prepared. I wasn't. I've seen Cassandra in a lot of states, laughing so hard she couldn't breathe, angry enough to make me rethink every decision I've ever made. Exhausted, radiant, broken, but I had never seen her like this. She looked drained, like someone had found a switch inside her and slowly turned down everything that made her, her. Machines hummed in steady rhythm. An IV dripped quietly. And the woman who once chased a contractor out of our house with a wooden spoon for cutting corners was lying there. Small. I sat beside her, took her hand. It was colder than I expected. I leaned in and said softly, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere until I know exactly what happened to you. I'm not a man who makes promises lightly, but when I do, I keep them. I stepped back outside. Preston and Lindsay were in the waiting area. Of course they were. Preston stood up. Dad, we need to talk. There are things you don't. I raised my hand. Just once. He stopped mid-sentence. There must have been something on my face in that moment. I don't know what it was, but it was enough. I said, not now. Then I turned away, walked to the corner of the waiting room, sat down, took out my phone, and did the one thing they never expected me to do. I started locking everything down. Every account, every access point, every single thing they could touch. One by one I shut it all off. And when the notifications started lighting up their phones, I looked at Lindsay first. That smile, that out-of-place smile, gone, in a single second. And right then I knew. We weren't having a conversation anymore. We were in a war. And I had just kicked a hornet's nest. The only question left was how many hornets were inside. There's something you need to understand about denial. It isn't loud. It doesn't knock on your door and shout that something is wrong. It's more polite than that. It sits across from you, pours you a cup of coffee, and tells you everything is fine. That you're overthinking. That you're tired. That the people you love couldn't possibly do the things your instincts are screaming about. I lived with denial longer than I care to admit. But that night, sitting in the hospital parking lot at 9:43 p.m., with Cassandra somewhere above me hooked to machines, and Preston's expression replaying in my head, I got rid of it, permanently. Changed the locks. Threw away the key. I called Kurt. He picked up immediately. Talk to me, he said. She looks bad, Kurt, I said. And my voice betrayed me on that last word. The doctor mentioned toxicity. Said it's been building. Not sudden. I heard him exhale slowly. Then he said, Warren, building means intentional. I know, I said. And Preston and Lindsay were at the house. They're in the waiting room right now. Silence. Then Kurt said something I will never forget. You need to think very carefully about who's had access to Cassandra's food, drinks, and medication every day for the past few months. A pause. Who's been there? And then, it hit. Not a sound you hear, the kind you feel. 4 months ago, Cassandra twisted her ankle coming down the stairs. Nothing serious, but enough for Preston to step in, almost immediately. He suggested Lindsay come by every morning, help Cassandra with breakfast, her medication, keep an eye on things while I was at work. At the time, I thought it was care. I even told Kurt maybe I'd misjudged the kid. If I could go back to that moment, I'd do something very simple. I'd slap myself. I went back to the waiting room. Preston was standing near the vending machine, arms crossed, trying to look innocent, failing, spectacularly. Lindsay was sitting down, her phone face down on her lap. And you need to understand this, Lindsay never puts her phone down. I've seen her scroll during holiday prayers. So a phone placed face down. That's not a habit. That's strategy. I sat across from them. Preston spoke first. Dad, I know how this looks. I looked at him. Do you? Tell me how you think it looks. He shifted. Mom's had health issues for a while. We've just been helping. Lindsay comes every morning to make sure she eats and takes her vitamins. Vitamins. I repeated it. 3 supplements, he said. Which ones? I asked. He blinked. I said it again. Which ones? He looked at Lindsay. Lindsay looked down. 3 seconds. Just 3 seconds. But enough. Enough for me to not need another answer. I stood up. You two go home, I said. Dad, Preston started. I said his name once. Quiet. But enough. Go home. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Because at that point I didn't have doubts anymore. I knew. And once you know, everything changes. The only question left was how far they'd gone. I sat alone in the waiting room with a cup of hospital coffee, and calling it coffee was already being generous. The clock read 2:00 a.m., and I started doing what any reasonable man would do when he suspects his own son might be poisoning his wife. I started digging, layer by layer, detail by detail. I opened the banking app, the last 6 months. I'm not an accountant. I don't even like online banking, but even I could see it. Something wasn't right. Small withdrawals. $200, $250, $202. Numbers that don't draw attention. They don't shout. They whisper. But when you add them up, they tell a different story. $11,000 in 5 months. From our joint account, mine and Cassandra's, the account Preston had access to for emergencies. $11,000. I stared at that number for a long time. Then I called Kurt. He picked up like he'd been waiting. 11,000, I said. No greeting. No build-up. From which account, he asked. The joint one. Small withdrawals. Regular. Deliberate. Kurt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Warren, this isn't impulsive. This is a plan. Someone sat down and figured out how to not get caught. I closed my eyes. Just for a second. Then I said, my son. Those 2 words. I never thought I'd say them like that. In that context. Kurt spoke carefully. We're not completely certain yet. I said no. I know. Silence. Heavy. The kind you don't just hear, you feel it pressing against your ribs. Then Kurt said, Warren, I need you to prepare yourself. You think 11,000 is the problem, but I have a feeling. There's something much bigger behind it. And this is the part you need to remember. Kurt was about to find something that would make $11,000 look like pocket change. And it would change everything. If you've made it this far, do me a small favor. Hit subscribe. Seriously, so many people watch but never do. It costs you nothing, but it means more than you think. Thank you. Because what happened next wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't just about suspicion anymore. It was about realizing the person you trusted most might have been planning something you couldn't even bring yourself to imagine. I leaned back in the chair, stared up at the hospital ceiling. Cold white lights. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. And for the first time in hours, I wasn't wondering if I was right. I started wondering what I was still missing. The next morning, Kurt called me at 7:14. I remember the exact time, because I was staring at the clock, watching every minute crawl by waiting to be allowed in to see Cassandra. He didn't say hello. He went straight in. Warren, you need to prepare yourself. I didn't stand. I sat down, set my coffee aside. Go on. 6 weeks before Cassandra was admitted, she met with an attorney about her will. Alone. She didn't tell you. I closed my eyes. That part wasn't unusual. Cassandra liked surprises. She planned everything. Birthdays, anniversaries. Even dinner could feel like a military operation. But what Kurt said next that changed everything. She updated her insurance policy. The old one, Preston, was the secondary beneficiary. Standard. You set that up years ago. But Cassandra changed it. She removed Preston completely and transferred the full benefit to a charitable foundation. One she's been quietly building for the past 2 years. The policy value $2.3 million. I didn't say anything. Not because I had nothing to say, but because everything suddenly connected, like pieces of a puzzle snapping into place. Preston knew. I don't know how, but he knew. He knew his mother was about to erase his name from $2.3 million. And instead of calling her, instead of asking, instead of doing anything a normal person would do, he sat down with his wife and made a decision. Make sure Cassandra didn't live long enough to finalize the paperwork. 30 days. The attorney had a 30-day processing window, and Cassandra had exactly 30 days. I sat there, in the waiting room, not moving, not thinking, just letting the full weight of that truth settle on me. $11,000 was never the goal, just the opening move. If you've made it this far, and you think this story has already gone far enough, believe me, it goes further. If you want more stories like this, hit like and subscribe. It really helps. Thank you. I stood up, straightened my jacket, took a deep breath, and made a decision. I wasn't going to explode. I wasn't going to confront them. I wasn't going to give them even a second to prepare. I was going to do the one thing they never thought I could do. I was going to be patient. I called my lawyer, Margaret Holloway, 30 years of experience. A voice that didn't need volume to command silence. I told her everything. The money, the vitamins, the insurance, the timeline. She was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "Don't touch anything in the house. Don't talk to them. Don't post anything. Don't hint at anything." "Can you do that?" "I can," I said. "Good," she replied. "Because when this unfolds, it will unfold completely. No way out." I want them to feel every part of it. She said, "Trust me. They will feel every square inch." For the first time in hours, I almost smiled. Almost. Because now this wasn't suspicion anymore. This was a plan. And me. The next 72 hours were the longest of my life. Not because nothing was happening, but because too much was happening all at once. Cassandra started to stabilize. Dr. Nash said the treatment was working. Her kidney function was improving. And on the second day she opened her eyes, looked at me, and said in a weak voice that still somehow carried its edge, "Warren, you look terrible." I laughed. A real laugh. Right there in the ICU, the nurse looked at me, like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had lost a piece of it. But hearing Cassandra speak like that again, that familiar sharpness I'd lived with for 23 years, it was like someone flipped a switch back on inside my chest. I took her hand. "You're safe," I said. "Everything's being handled." She looked at me, longer than usual, then said very quietly, "It's Preston, isn't it?" Not a question. A conclusion. I didn't answer. I just tightened my grip on her hand. She closed her eyes again. "You know," she murmured, "I always thought he got the worst parts of me, and none of the good ones." Even like that, Cassandra still saw more clearly than anyone else. By the 4th day, Margaret called. Her tone hadn't changed, but the content had. "Warren, we have enough." Kurt had done his work. Security footage from a pharmacy 2 towns over. 3 purchases. Same supplement each time. Always paid in cash. Always alone. Except the 3rd time, Lindsay sat in the car, waiting. That supplement contained a compound. Taken over time in small doses, tasteless. It created exactly the toxicity pattern Dr. Nash had identified. Margaret continued, "We have bank statements. We have the money trail. We have access logs. And here's the part you'll appreciate." Preston called the attorney's office. Pretended to be Cassandra's assistant. Asked about the status of the policy change. He left a number. His own. I was silent. 10 seconds. Then I said, Kurt, did I raise a criminal mastermind? Or an idiot? Kurt replied. Both. And that's the problem. If you've made it this far, you already know where this is going. But trust me, how it happens is what you'll remember. Hit subscribe. Stay until the end. Because this is where things start getting paid for. Day 5, they came to the hospital. Together. Carrying flowers. Flowers. I looked at that bouquet and realized some people don't understand irony until it's standing right in front of them. Preston walked in, smiling. Dad, how's Mom doing? We've been so worried. I looked at him, then at Lindsay, then back again. She's awake, I said. She's talking, and she's going to make a full recovery. I saw it. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not relief, not happiness. Calculation. Quick, cold. Lindsay said. That's wonderful news. I nodded, then said the police are on their way. No raised voice, no drama. Just a sentence. Like I was commenting on the weather. The color drained from Preston's face so fast it was almost impressive. What Margaret filed everything this morning, I said. The footage. The bank records. The calls. The toxicology. All of it. Neatly packaged. Lindsay made a sound, not a word. Just the moment a person loses control. Preston started, Dad. Just listen. I cut him off. No. There isn't a sentence in this language that can explain what you did. So don't. I glanced at the flowers. Then said, Niece bouquet. Cassandra will love them. From someone else. They were arrested right there in the hospital parking lot. I stood by the window looking down. Everything unfolded exactly the way Margaret said it would. No shouting, no chaos. Just 2 uniformed officers walking up a few quiet words, and then the handcuffs. Preston tried to say something. He always believed words were his strongest weapon. This time they didn't work. Lindsay stayed silent. The calculated kind of silence. Like she was already one move ahead, thinking about deals, thinking about reduced sentences. Kurt was standing next to me. I didn't even notice when he arrived. He's always been like that. Shows up when it matters. He asked, How do you feel? I thought for a moment. Then I told the truth. Like I've aged 10 years in 5 days. Like I want to sleep for a month. Like I've lost something I'm never getting back. I paused. Then added, But also, like this is the first time in my life I'm completely certain about something. Kurt nodded. What about Cassandra? I turned back toward the hallway. Through the small window of her room I could see her. Small, but still there. Cassandra's going to be fine, I said. She always is. She's the strongest person I know. And she chose to marry me. That alone proves she can survive anything. Kurt laughed. A real laugh. Light, short, but enough to take some weight out of the air. 3 months later, Cassandra walked back into the house. A Saturday morning. Golden light spilling through the hallway. She stood there looking around like she was taking inventory of everything she almost lost. Then she turned to me and said, Warren, the kitchen needs repainting. I looked at her, then at the wall, then back at her. No chance, I said. I just painted it 2 years ago. She pointed. That's not white, she said. That's the color of an administrative apology. I looked again, then picked up my phone and called a painter. If you've come this far with me, you've seen everything. But there's one thing you should take with you. You can't control what people become in the dark. You can only control what you do when the lights come on. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, join us. Hit like, subscribe. Because stories like this, they're not just about revenge. They're about truth. And what we do when we finally see it. The trial lasted 11 days. 11 days of hearing everything again. Every detail. Every piece of evidence. Every cold decision replayed in front of everyone. I sat there, next to Cassandra, her hand in mine steady firm as if what happened hadn't broken her. Margaret stood across the room, calm, precise. Not a single wasted word. She didn't need drama. The truth was heavy enough. Pharmacy footage, bank records, toxicology reports, the impersonated phone call. Each piece on its own just a fragment. But put together, it wasn't suspicion anymore. It was a map, a plan, clear, calculated, intentional. Preston sat there in a suit I once paid for, staring straight ahead. Not at me, not at Cassandra. Lindsay was different. She kept looking around, assessing, measuring, like she was still searching for a way out. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. The jury stepped out. The room went quiet. A familiar kind of silence, but this time it wasn't heavy. It wasn't frightening. It was just waiting. 4 hours later they came back. I didn't stand. I didn't need to. When things are that clear, you don't question the ending. The judge read the verdict. Guilty. Both of them. Conspiracy. Attempted murder. Financial fraud. The words landed not fast, not slow, just certain. I didn't look at Preston. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't need to. That moment wasn't about him anymore. It was about Cassandra. She squeezed my hand, tighter, like steel. Then she leaned closer and whispered, "I want Thai food." I turned to her. Now she opened her eyes, looked at me and said, "I've been thinking about Thai food for 3 months, Warren. Don't test me." I nodded. "All right." We stood up, walked out of the courtroom, left everything behind. If you've come this far, you've already seen what matters most. Not the verdict, not the crime, but what comes after. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit like and subscribe. Because the one thing I want you to remember isn't what they did, it's what we survived. And this story didn't end in the courtroom. It ended where it began. At home. I told you from the very beginning I came home early, and I wished that house had been empty. I was wrong. I'm glad I came home. I'm glad I walked through that door. And if you think that was just luck, it wasn't. That was the moment the light came on. And when the light comes on, you don't get to look away. You have to see. You have to face it. You have to decide what you're going to do next. 3 months later, we were sitting around a table. Cassandra, Kurt, Margaret, Dr. Nash. Everyone was laughing, talking. Cassandra was telling one long story, waving her hands around like she had never spent a day in intensive care. And I looked at her, not because I'd never looked before, but because this time I understood the value of being able to. There are things in life you assume will always be there until you almost lose them. Family, trust, safety. And when those things break, they don't always break loudly. Sometimes they break in silence, one piece at a time. That was the first lesson. Do not ignore small signs. The details you keep talking yourself into believing don't matter, because sometimes those small things are the very things trying to save you. The second lesson, don't let denial become your shelter. The truth does not disappear just because you refuse to look at it. It just waits. And when it comes back, it usually brings consequences with it. And the last lesson, you cannot control what other people become in the dark, but you can control how you respond when the light comes on. You can choose action, choose truth, choose to protect what matters. If you are in a situation where your instincts are telling you something is wrong, don't stay silent. Don't wait. Look closer. Ask more questions. And if necessary, act sooner. Because I came home just 1 day early. 1 day. And that day saved my wife's life. If you stayed with me all the way to the end, thank you, truly. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, join our community. Hit like, subscribe, because here we don't just tell stories. We talk about what happens inside families in the dark, and in the moments when everything changes, and maybe the next story will be the one you need to hear at exactly the right time. My future son-in-law, Julian, was casually insulting my daughter Chloe right there in my car. He sneered into the phone with his friend. He called Chloe annoying. He said comforting her was just a mandatory procedure before the wedding. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a glass of water, some snacks, get comfortable, and remember this: the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose otherwise. Leave a number 1 in the comments so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe. You're going to love this one. The story began with the screeching sound of tires sliding across the damp road. Through the rearview mirror, I saw Julian's face. He was leaning back in the rear seat, his eyes fixed on his phone screen, a smug smile spread across his face. He had no idea that the rideshare driver taking him to his destination was actually his future father-in-law. To Julian, I was just an invisible man. An elderly driver, quiet, always wearing a mask that covered most of his face, and a cap pulled low over his eyes. He casually insulted my daughter, his fiancée, treating her like a commodity. I heard every single word clearly, and I would remember them for a very long time because those words were like knives stabbing straight into the heart of a father. The daughter I cherished, like a priceless treasure, was in his eyes. Nothing more than a target with a price tag attached. My blood felt as though it were boiling. I had to use every bit of composure I had left to stop myself from turning the car around and punching that fake face of his. I took a deep breath and forced myself to remain silent. I needed to stay clear-headed. My anger at that moment would ruin everything. The car continued moving forward through the suffocating silence. Julian kept talking endlessly about his plans to manipulate Chloe after they were married. He had calculated every step to strip my daughter of her freedom. The deception was obvious in every cold word that came out of his mouth. I looked at myself again in the rearview mirror. The expression in my eyes was no longer one of shock. It had become the determination of a father willing to do whatever it took to protect his child. This battle was only beginning. Julian thought he was smart, but he had no idea that this rearview mirror was capturing every part of his true nature. Julian ended the call. Silence once again settled over the cramped interior of the car. I watched him through the still rearview mirror. Julian adjusted the collar of his neatly pressed shirt. He ran a hand through his hair, restoring his usual polished appearance. He paid absolutely no attention to the driver sitting in front of him. Becoming invisible in Julian's eyes was actually very easy. All I needed was a black medical mask, a pair of sunglasses that concealed my eyes, and a baseball cap pulled low over my forehead. But the biggest reason he failed to recognize me was his arrogance. To a young and successful chief financial officer like Julian, people who worked with their hands were nothing more than part of the scenery. He looked, but he never truly saw. He climbed into the car, gave his destination, and immediately disappeared into his own world of privilege. I still remember the very first day I accepted his ride 3 weeks earlier. When the app displayed the passenger's name as Julian and the pickup location as a luxury apartment complex in the suburbs, my heart skipped a beat. He was the fiancé Chloe always spoke about with such pride. The moment he opened the door and stepped into the back seat, I held my breath. I was afraid he would recognize me. I was afraid my presence would somehow damage my daughter's relationship. But Julian merely glanced at his phone screen and casually told me to get moving. My initial relief quickly turned into a bitter realization. The man who was about to marry my daughter was a completely different person when she wasn't around. For the past 3 weeks, I had quietly become the keeper of evidence, documenting Julian's double life. While Chloe looked at him with admiration and love, I sat here witnessing his cold conversations, selfish calculations, and carefully hidden contempt. Every ride was a new chapter in the book of lies he was writing. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. A feeling of helplessness and pain rose inside me. Was I protecting my daughter through this cowardly silence? Or was I becoming an accomplice to a deceiver? The car stopped at another red light. Julian sighed impatiently. He pulled out his phone again and dialed a new number. I stared into the rearview mirror, holding my breath as I waited. Julian's voice filled the car once more, this time lower, more secretive, carrying a revelation that could shatter the entire future Chloe was dreaming of. Julian ended the call. Silence once again settled over the cramped interior of the car. I watched him through the still rearview mirror. Julian adjusted the collar of his neatly pressed shirt. He ran a hand through his hair, restoring his usual polished appearance. He paid absolutely no attention to the driver sitting in front of him. Becoming invisible in Julian's eyes was actually very easy. All I needed was a black medical mask, a pair of sunglasses that concealed my eyes, and a baseball cap pulled low over my forehead. But the biggest reason he failed to recognize me was his arrogance. To a young and successful chief financial officer like Julian, people who worked with their hands were nothing more than part of the scenery. He looked, but he never truly saw. He climbed into the car, gave his destination, and immediately disappeared into his own world of privilege. I still remember the very first day I accepted his ride 3 weeks earlier. When the app displayed the passenger's name as Julian and the pickup location as a luxury apartment complex in the suburbs, my heart skipped a beat. He was the fiancé Chloe always spoke about with such pride. The moment he opened the door and stepped into the back seat, I held my breath. I was afraid he would recognize me. I was afraid my presence would somehow damage my daughter's relationship, but Julian merely glanced at his phone screen and casually told me to get moving. My initial relief quickly turned into a bitter realization. The man who was about to marry my daughter was a completely different person when she wasn't around. For the past 3 weeks, I had quietly become the keeper of evidence, documenting Julian's double life. While Chloe looked at him with admiration and love, I sat here witnessing his cold conversations, selfish calculations, and carefully hidden contempt. Every ride was a new chapter in the book of lies he was writing. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. A feeling of helplessness and pain rose inside me. Was I protecting my daughter through this cowardly silence? Or was I becoming an accomplice to a deceiver? The car stopped at another red light. Julian sighed impatiently. He pulled out his phone again and dialed a new number. I stared into the rearview mirror, holding my breath as I waited. Julian's voice filled the car once more, this time lower, more secretive, carrying a revelation that could shatter the entire future Chloe was dreaming of. The personnel appointment decision in Phoenix, Arizona. My hands began to tremble. I nearly pressed the accelerator by mistake. Julian had started a new call. His voice sounded excited, but it was filled with calculated malice. He confirmed to the person on the other end that he had accepted the position of director at a new branch in Arizona. It was more than 1,800 miles away from our home, away from Columbus. My mind spun. Just last night, during our family dinner, Chloe had happily talked about how the two of them were looking to buy a small house only 3 blocks from mine. My daughter completely trusted that they would stay here close to family. She had no idea she was about to be uprooted and thrown into a strange land far from everything she knew. I bit my lip until I tasted blood to stop myself from shouting. Julian kept talking endlessly about his plans. He spoke about the move as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He did not need to discuss it with Chloe. He only needed to inform her once everything had already been decided. The deception had reached its peak. He was isolating my daughter. He wanted to sever every connection between her and the people who loved her. Alone in an unfamiliar place, she would be completely vulnerable and forced to depend on him. The anger inside me churned like a storm. I stared at the road ahead, but my thoughts were in chaos. My poor daughter was still drowning in a manufactured happiness. She was carefully planning her wedding while this man was secretly building a strategy to remove her family from her life. The contrast was cruel. It squeezed the heart of a father until it hurt. Julian leaned his head back against the seat. Then he said something to his best friend over the phone. The words made my blood run cold. The farther she is from her family, the easier everything becomes. I looked into the rearview mirror again. Julian was smiling. It was the satisfied smile of a man who believed he had already won the game. A chill settled deep inside me. I knew I could not remain silent any longer. Tonight would be our family dinner. I had to find a way to warn Chloe before it was too late, but I could never have imagined that my daughter's blind love and Julian's cunning manipulation would turn my attempt to protect her into a complete disaster. The family dinner took place in the suffocating atmosphere of our small kitchen. The warm yellow light shone down on Chloe's radiant face and Julian's perfect smile. Watching them sit side by side made my chest tighten. I could see the deception lurking beneath the neatly pressed shirt of my future son-in-law. I tried to remain calm. I refilled Julian's glass and carefully began asking about his plans for the future. I mentioned that his company was expanding into other states. Then I casually asked whether he had ever considered relocating somewhere far away like Arizona. The atmosphere at the table instantly shifted. Julian froze for a brief second. A flash of surprise crossed his eyes, but he quickly regained his usual composure. With an awkward smile, he brushed the question aside and said that he always prioritized whatever was best for Chloe. But Chloe's reaction was the real knife to my heart. My daughter immediately put down her chopsticks. She looked at me with disappointment and anger in her eyes. Chloe defended Julian fiercely. She said I was always too suspicious. She accused me of deliberately searching for flaws where none existed in order to ruin her happiness. The bond between father and daughter cracked right there in our own home. Then Chloe said something that shattered my heart. She told me that I was always waiting for things to fall apart just so I could prove that I had been right all along. Pain and helplessness rose like a lump in my throat. I looked at my daughter, a good person who was being cruelly deceived. The frustration of a father who knew the truth but could not immediately present the evidence pushed my emotions to their breaking point. I had to remain silent to keep the situation from getting worse. Julian sat there calmly, taking a small sip of wine. The look he gave me was openly provocative. He knew he had won this round. He had successfully turned me into nothing more than a paranoid, selfish old man in the eyes of his fiancée. The dinner ended in cold silence. Chloe stood up with Julian and left without looking back at me even once. I remained alone in the darkness of the kitchen, listening as the sound of Julian's car faded into the distance. My anger hardened into an unshakable decision. Words alone were no longer enough. The next morning Julian booked another ride with me. He climbed into the back seat with the same attitude, treating me as though I were invisible. Almost immediately, he called his attorney. I held my breath and adjusted the familiar rearview mirror to listen. The words that came out of his mouth next, concerning a secret contract, made me realize something horrifying. This man did not merely want to take my daughter far away from her family. He wanted to turn her into a prisoner with not a single dollar to her name. Julian's cold voice echoed from the back seat. He was on the phone with his private attorney. Once again, the rearview mirror became a witness to this man's cruelty. Julian began discussing a secret prenuptial agreement. Using dry legal terminology, he carefully calculated how to protect every part of his assets. But the most despicable part was that he was setting a trap designed to strip Chloe of her rights. He wanted her to sign unfavorable clauses without ever realizing what they meant. Helping others heal emotionally was my daughter's greatest passion. She had spent years studying to earn her position as a counselor. Yet over the phone, Julian openly declared that he would force Chloe to quit her job as soon as they were married. He said the work consumed too much time and offered no financial value to him. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles began to ache. The anger inside me churned until it felt like it was crushing my chest. Anyone could see that Julian was building an invisible cage around Chloe. He did not want a partner to share his life with. He wanted an obedient doll displayed behind glass. A woman with no career, no independent finances, and no meaningful connection to her family. That was how he planned to exert financial control and manipulate every aspect of my daughter's life. My inner thoughts shifted from fear and helplessness to unwavering determination. I could not stand by and watch my daughter walk willingly into that nightmare. The frustration I had suppressed for weeks had transformed into a burning resolve to act. I looked into the rearview mirror. There was no hesitation left in my eyes. Julian continued talking without pause, completely absorbed in what he believed was his flawless victory. He thought he was clever. He thought every piece on the board was exactly where he wanted it. But he had forgotten one thing. The invisible driver sitting in front of him was remembering every single word. I understood that the warnings I had tried to give Chloe at dinner the night before had been completely useless. Her blind faith in Julian required something stronger than my suspicions. I needed undeniable proof. I needed facts that could not be explained away. This deception had to be exposed at its source. The ride ended when Julian stepped out in front of a towering office building. He slammed the car door without a word of thanks and hurried off to join the flow of well-dressed professionals. I watched him disappear into the crowd, a cold feeling settling deep inside me. Then I pulled out my phone and called an old friend. It was time to enlist the help of someone who knew how to uncover the truth. What I did not expect was that the first warning from my old friend would send a chill down my spine and reveal just how dangerous the man my daughter intended to marry truly was. I arranged to meet Walter at a small diner tucked away on a quiet street corner. He was a former private investigator with 30 years of experience confronting the darker side of human nature. Walter looked over my rough notes, then lowered his reading glasses. He took a long breath, his voice calm, steady, and shaped by decades of experience. Walter spoke to me with complete seriousness. Men like Julian aren't criminals. They don't kill people or rob banks. They simply believe they're smarter than everyone else. Manipulators like him always leave traces in financial records and hidden schedules. Walter warned me to stop relying on suspicion alone. The anger of a father would cloud my judgment. What I needed was the truth. Only undeniable evidence could save Chloe. The advice from my old friend hit me like a bucket of cold water. It forced me to see things clearly. I could no longer continue playing the role of a passive driver. I began a quiet but dangerous search for the truth. Under Walter's guidance, I documented every time Julian entered my car. I recorded his calculating phone conversations through the rearview mirror. I collected drafts of prenuptial agreements that he accidentally left behind or discussed during rides. With each passing day, the phone in the pocket of this old driver filled with more evidence of Julian's selfishness and deception. The frustration inside me remained tightly controlled, transforming into the foundation of a carefully planned counterattack. If you've made it this far into the story, then perhaps you're enjoying it. Please do us a quick favor, like and subscribe. Leave a number 5 in the comments so I know you've watched this far, and tell me how you think the story will end to see whether your prediction is correct. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. I slipped the phone back into my shirt pocket. It felt as though I were carrying a ticking time bomb. Every piece of Julian's double life had now been exposed. He was scheduled to sign a lease agreement in Arizona the following week. He was also close to finalizing the financial trap he had prepared for my daughter. Everything was moving at a terrifying speed. That afternoon, the ride request notification sounded once again. The passenger was Julian. I pulled my cap lower and drove to pick him up as usual. What I never expected was that during this ride, Julian would suddenly start a conversation with me. The man who had always treated me as if I were invisible now wanted advice from an old driver. It was a cruel joke of fate, one that pushed the tension to an entirely new level. Julian climbed into the car. This time he did not immediately look at his phone. Instead, he let out a long, weary sigh. Through the rearview mirror, I saw him lift his head and stare directly at the back of my neck. The silence lingered for several seconds. For the first time in 3 weeks, Julian voluntarily spoke to this invisible driver. His tone carried the usual arrogance disguised beneath a thin layer of false humility. He asked whether I had a family, and whether older women made unreasonable demands the way younger women supposedly did. The irony of the situation made my heart skip a beat. The manipulator was seeking marriage advice from the very father he was trying to isolate from his daughter. I forced my anger deep into my chest. Deliberately lowering my voice and altering my manner of speaking so he would not recognize me, I answered with a simple piece of advice. Listen more than you talk. But Julian's arrogance ran too deep. He immediately dismissed my response. With a smug laugh, he launched into a lengthy speech about himself. He claimed that women did not know what they truly wanted until a successful man laid out a path for them. He proudly boasted that he had prepared a major surprise for his fiancée. Then, he began talking about tomorrow's extravagant engagement celebration at Brookside Country Club. That would be the moment, he said, when he would publicly announce all of his decisions in front of everyone. Once it was done before an audience, Chloe would have no way to refuse. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead. My hands tightened around the steering wheel until they felt numb. The irony and hidden tension inside that vehicle had reached a breaking point. Julian genuinely believed he was designing a perfect future. He convinced himself that his control and manipulation would be wrapped in such a romantic package that nobody would dare oppose it. What he did not know was that every word he spoke and every piece of evidence he left behind was already in my possession. The car eventually stopped in front of his office building. Julian stepped out, threw one final arrogant glance in my direction, and walked away without another word. I watched his retreating figure through the windshield. My eyes were colder and more determined than they had ever been. The patience I had maintained for an entire month was nearly exhausted. Tomorrow he planned to unveil his perfect future. Tomorrow I planned to show Chloe exactly who had designed it. The final confrontation would take place at Brookside Country Club before 100 guests. I had everything I needed. What I never anticipated, however, was that the moment I abandoned my anonymity and exposed Julian would also uncover another horrifying secret hidden within those documents. A secret far darker than anything I had discovered so far. The ballroom at Brookside Country Club shimmered beneath sparkling lights while soft piano music drifted through the air. 100 elegantly dressed guests mingled and exchanged congratulations. Julian stood on the stage in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. Beside him stood Chloe. My daughter looked radiant in her pure white dress. She gazed at Julian with all the trust and love of a woman about to become a wife. The purity of my daughter only made the deception of the man beside her seem even more disgusting. Julian stepped up to the microphone. With confidence, he announced a surprise gift for his fiancée. He declared that the two of them would be moving to Arizona immediately after the wedding to begin a new life of luxury and success. Using polished romantic language, he transformed the act of isolating Chloe from her family into what sounded like a grand gesture of love. Chloe froze. The smile vanished from her face. Shock spread across her features. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Julian subtly tightened his arm around her waist, a silent reminder that she was expected to agree in front of 100 guests. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The frustration I had carried for weeks finally erupted. I stepped out from behind the ballroom doors. I was no longer dressed as a rideshare driver. I wore a tailored suit. I removed the black medical mask. I took off the sunglasses. Then I lifted my head and walked directly toward the stage. Whispers immediately spread throughout the room. "Dad," Chloe's voice trembled with shock. Julian saw me. For a brief moment, confusion flashed across his face. Then his familiar arrogance returned. He opened his mouth, preparing to greet his future father-in-law with polite charm. I never gave him the chance. I climbed onto the stage, pulled a thick folder from my jacket, and slammed it onto the signing table. The sharp crack echoed through the ballroom. Instantly, the room fell silent. The silence was so complete that it felt as though everyone could hear a single spoon hit the floor. I looked directly into Julian's eyes. Then I spoke loudly enough for every guest to hear. I exposed his entire scheme. I turned on the recorder I had carried in my pocket. Julian's cold, calculating voice filled the ballroom. "The farther she is from her family, the easier everything becomes." The words echoed through the stunned crowd. Then came the discussions about the secret prenuptial agreement, the clauses that would force Chloe to leave her career, the plans that would leave her financially dependent, the strategy designed to turn her into a prisoner with no assets and no independence. The color drained from Julian's face. His confidence vanished. His arrogance shattered. For the first time since I had known him, he looked afraid. Suddenly, he lunged toward me, attempting to grab the recorder. But Walter was already moving. My old friend stepped between us and blocked him. The mask had finally been ripped away. Before 100 witnesses, the respected financial executive stood exposed as a manipulative fraud. Whispers of shock swept through the crowd. Expressions of disgust appeared everywhere I looked. The carefully crafted image Julian had spent years building collapsed in a matter of minutes, and the satisfaction of seeing the truth revealed was overwhelming. Chloe stared at Julian as if she were looking at a complete stranger. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Then she turned toward me. In that moment she understood. Every warning, every concern, every uncomfortable question I had asked, they had all been true. Yet amid the chaos, something unexpected happened. Julian suddenly began to laugh. Not nervously, not awkwardly. He laughed wildly. The sound echoed across the silent ballroom. Then he fixed me with a look filled with hatred. His eyes moved toward the folder, lying on the table. And with a voice trembling between rage and triumph, he shouted one final sentence. A sentence that revealed a secret hidden within those documents. A secret that even I had not yet discovered because I had never finished reading every page. And the moment those words left his mouth, the entire room went silent once again. Julian shouted in desperation. He claimed that without him, my family's company would collapse into bankruptcy. He believed money could conceal every rotten part of his character. But he was wrong. Chloe stepped forward. She was no longer crying. The only things left in her eyes were cold determination and clarity. Slowly, she removed her diamond engagement ring. Then she threw it directly at Julian. In a firm voice, Chloe declared that he had never respected her. He had only ever loved himself. The crowd erupted into applause. Humiliated, Julian lowered his head and walked out of the ballroom beneath a storm of disapproving stares. His double life had finally come to an end. 6 months passed quickly. Our lives gradually returned to a peaceful routine. Chloe never moved to Arizona. She remained in Columbus and expanded her own counseling practice. My daughter regained both her independence and the radiant smile she once had. Seeing her happy again brought me a sense of relief I could hardly describe. I often sat in my living room looking out the window and reflecting on everything that had happened. As a father, I learned an important lesson. Protecting your children does not mean solving every problem for them or making every decision on their behalf. Protecting them means helping them see the truth even when that truth is painful. Once the true nature of a liar is exposed, you must allow them to make their own choice. My daughter grew stronger through that painful experience. Thank you for staying with Dad's real-life revenge until the end of this story. Join our community by liking and subscribing to enjoy more compelling stories centered around family loyalty and justice. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. The rearview mirror in my car is still there. It is no longer a witness to deception. Now it reflects only my peaceful smile and my daughter's freedom. The truth may arrive late, but justice and the love of family will always be the strongest fortress of all.